Serenbe is a place where people live, work, learn, and play in celebration of life's beauty. And we're here to share the stories that connect residents and guests to each other and to nature. This is Serenbe Stories. Welcome back to Serenbe Stories. Hi, Steve. How are you?
It's fun to think about reminiscing to some of the years past.
I know. And in the last episode, we talked about what it was like in the early 90s when you bought the original farmhouse, sold your company, and moved the family full-time down to the farm. So now I want to talk today. It's about, 10 years later. And there's an iconic story that I know about, but I've heard you tell a bunch of times that I would love you to share right now because it really sounds like that was one of the pivotal moments that sort of changed everything. And it was about a bulldozer.
That's right. So this is 10 years after the initial purchase. It's in my 7th year of retirement. Life seemed pretty perfect. We were traveling, had the organic garden. We were totally delighted with the retired lifestyle. We had the bed and breakfast, which was kind of a hobby on the weekends, but nothing too serious. And then one morning, my daughter and I, Garnie, were out on a morning jog. And as we came over the crest of the hill, the forest next to us was being bulldozed.
Yikes.
And this just sent chills. And I ran out to stop the bulldozer to see what was going on. And his response was, "We've simply been hired to clear the land. I guess they're putting houses here. That's what always happens." And I, in panic, ran back to the house to call the retired doctor who owned this. He lived in Fayette County, a couple of counties away, and I couldn't get an answer. And I kept calling, and for the next couple of days, no answer, which felt strange. And so I started calling other landowners that I was aware of that had larger properties that a developer might have talked to. And as I called, no one knew anything about what was happening. And of course, I ended every conversation, "Well, if you ever decide to sell, call me."
Uh-oh.
And it's interesting what happens, or I'm not even sure what I think about the synchronicity, if it was just coincidence. But the 3 largest parcels that touched us had to sell for different reasons.
Okay.
One parcel had been in a family for 3 generations.
Okay.
And when I talked to the elderly woman who owned it, after a 2-hour conversation in her living room, which was covered with white sheets, I found out that her nieces had just had her removed as the executor because she had not paid taxes in 5 years. And the family had to sell the property. Another man I called said he had inherited it from his father, but he was in a divorce, and the property was the only thing outside the divorce that he could liquidate, and he wanted to sell. Okay. And the third family shared that they had bought the farm to raise their family 30 years previously, and kids were grown, and they had just returned from LJ, where their grandchildren now were, and they decided that morning to sell the farm, and they were getting ready to call a realtor. Okay. So here are 3 distinct stories, each from a different generation who were the original purchasers, that came a time within that time I called that needed to sell.
Right. And you had about 300 acres at this point before the bulldozer kind of...
That's right. So that morning jog, I had put the original farm back together.
Oh, very cool.
And that was right at 300 acres.
Okay.
And I was just totally satisfied, not interested in buying anything else. And then over the next 5 weeks, I had another 600 acres under contract.
It's a lot of land.
When the retired doctor returned from his vacation in Europe, and I found out that he had sold it to someone down Hutchison Ferry Road who wanted to put a pasture airstrip in for his little prop plane. So the immediate threat of development was gone, but I look at it as my wake-up call that morning, that somehow I'd forgotten that this land was as close to Atlanta and was really in the future path of development. And so I see that morning as my wake-up call.
You're right. It is so wild to think how close we are to the city, a major metropolitan city like Atlanta, because out here, you really feel like you're in the middle of the woods. I mean, we are in the middle of the woods, but it's such a wonderful discovery to find the city in the woods, yet know you're so close to everything. So I know that you guys ran, I think Garnie ran cross country, but was that something that you guys did a lot together, running?
The morning we were out running, that was just a normal thing. I have been a runner for years. In fact, I ran in every Peachtree Road race for years. In fact, when the girls were babies, Marie would bring them up because we only lived 2 blocks from Peachtree Street when we were in Ansley Park. And so I was used to waving to them. And so they grew up watching me run the road race. And so in about middle school, Garnie decided she wanted to start running. And so naturally, I would go out running with her.
That's great.
And it was great because we were great runners. And so in 8th grade, she ran. And so as a freshman in high school, she tried out for the cross country team. And to her amazement, as a freshman, she was on the varsity and ran varsity all 4 years because of our running in the woods, because we had the hills and it was a great training area.
It was fantastic. So now you've bought up 600 acres. Did you just expect that they were going to build houses on there? Is that a typical reaction? I don't know if that's what I would have thought when I saw a bulldozer.
After the bulldozer incident, my first reaction was to protect my backyard. And it was like most people do, you try to buy it. Whatever you're wanting to protect, you buy it. And that was my first reaction. Let me just buy it so this doesn't happen. But at 900 acres, I realized I couldn't keep showing up for these closings. And that 900 acres really didn't protect you in the path of urban sprawl. And so I was in a unique position that I was concerned about our lifestyle in this wonderful rural countryside right on the edge of a major city. Mm-hmm. But also I had a lot of economic resources tied up in 900 acres. And so how do we find that balance between preservation and economic return? And I think this is something that used to be common for anyone to be in that sort of dual responsibility position. And today, when I look at the development community, it's fairly severed. And we have the preservationists and the developers on different sides. So I stepped into this with a foot in each camp, with that challenge of understanding how do we address both the economics and the preservation.
Right. And you had seen the sprawl in Metro Atlanta. You'd been here quite some time. But I know you've told me a story about opening a restaurant in Roswell. Can you just give me a little bit? Because I think that may have informed your decision as well.
When I look back, I realized that morning of panic, it was a lot of things from my past that were triggering. And why I might not have been thinking about it, it was why I reacted so powerfully. And I go back to my childhood. My family was some of the early settlers outside Boulder, Colorado, since the 1860s. The fields and ditch banks that I grew up on and the rural school that I went to was the same school that my mother went to, that my grandfather went to, and that my great-grandfather helped build. And so for generations, we were on the same land, and we knew the families that were next door to us. And back then, as in Metro Atlanta, Metro Denver, most of the people that owned that land didn't want anything to change.
Sure.
But then life changes. People die, money comes. And when the developers come calling, something happens. And so in my childhood, rural landscape is now suburban Denver. And I saw that happen over the course of 2 decades.
Right.
And then when I moved here, I got to know the families, and many of these families have been here 6, 7, 9 generations even. And it reminded me so much of where I came from Colorado. Although Colorado, these were Westerners who had, within the last century, settled it by covered wagon, as my family did, and the Southerners. While we were very different in lifestyle, there was the same stories and that same sense of love of the land. And so I realized how quickly it could disappear. When I opened my 3rd restaurant in Roswell, there was at least 4 miles of rural land that I drove through. It's 2 miles from 400 then to where you got over to 41. Huh. And there was only a church and 1 house on that 2-mile stretch.
Really?
400 was so quiet that there was not much traffic.
Imagine.
And today.
Yeah.
And so I saw Roswell change over the course of a couple decades to where now you do not know necessarily where Atlanta and Sandy Springs and Roswell begin and end. It's just all melded together as one strip of asphalt. And so all of those experiences from my childhood, from opening restaurants in Atlanta, I know played out into the urgency I felt that morning when I saw the bulldozer.
Did you have any sense at that point what you would do with the land?
Oh, at that point, I had no clue. When I started buying the land, it was purely just to protect our backyard. And then as I started thinking about what we could do, it was how can we preserve and protect the value? And it was at dinner one night with a dear friend, Ray Anderson, who is, of course, today a well-known environmentalist. Ray is a friend for years. In fact, his stepson's godfather to Quinn are now 30, almost 31-year-olds. So it's a long-standing friendship. Ray had used our bed and breakfast to entertain many of the environmental people, such as Paul Hawkins and Emery Levinson from the Rocky Mountain Institute, and all sorts of the big names that you know of today in the environmental movement. And Ray just realized we were doing a lot of environmental things with our bed and breakfast in a very simple, responsible way, whether it was how we were recycling or that we were growing our own food in our garden. And so at dinner one night, a purely social dinner, I shared with Ray the bulldozer incident and that I now own 900 acres. And I asked him who some of the smart people were that he knew that might come down and help us figure out how to save this greater area. Okay. He had just come off of being the first chair of the White House Council on the Environment. So he knew really national and global leaders in the environmental movement. Now, to put things in perspective, this is, a year or so before the first LEED certified building program had come out. Nobody knew this. This was way in the early stages of the environmental conversation. There were a few voices in the world screaming about the need, but really it wasn't the front of conversation. And so that led to Ray asking the Rocky Mountain Institute to facilitate thought leaders. And so in September of 2000, 23 thought leaders came for a 2-day conversation on the environment issues. It was tremendous. We had leaders in energy and water and agriculture all assembled here. And Georgia Tech was very impressed with this roster of folks. And so they came and documented the 2 days.
Great. Can you tell us what the Rocky Mountain Institute is, just for people who don't know? Yes,
the Rocky Mountain Institute, it's really one of the thought leaderships around a lot of the environmental movements. And they happen to be located in rural Colorado or in the mountains, and so it's known as the Rocky Mountain Institute. But it's globally recognized. Emery, who heads it, was named one of Time's 20 thought leaders for the last century.
Wow.
in 2000. So these were, they assembled a real thought leadership group.
So tell us a little bit about, I think you guys called it a charrette, and that's another sort of word that maybe we don't hear a lot about. What is that? It's a group of people getting together? Or?
Charrette it's actually a French term, but used by the planning industry.
Okay.
And it's when you come together as a group, and the idea that thoughts are different when you have them in a group. Mm-hmm. And so it's a group exercise to plan and discuss. And that something different comes out from the collective than just in more a management style.
So what happened over those couple days?
So it was really great fun that all these during that charrette in 2000, it was great fun to associate with all of these thought leaders, to hear the issues that they were presenting. But as it concluded, I realized that no one had shared how we were going to save this area. It really was more of a discussion of all these various global issues. Mm-hmm. And while we talked about how some of them might apply here for their various industries, such as what was important for water or what was important for energy and land use, there was no one who was in the development world that was going to come in or figure out how we were going to do this.
So you had a room full of maybe environmentalists, but nobody on what we would call the development side. And maybe that's because traditionally they're not talking to each other, or
they were primarily environmentalists. Mm-hmm. However, we did have a representative from the Urban Land Institute.
Okay.
Interestingly, that was Jim Durrett, who's now a resident here.
Interesting.
As people change. And so we had the voice at the table, but not an active developer voice necessarily that was going to capture the need or the imagination of how to address this. Mm-hmm. In fact, one thing I learned is there was hardly anyone addressing environmental issues as it related to the built environment.
Right. And again, you're saying that LEED hadn't started, which was created by the Green Building Association. And LEED is basically certification for primarily commercial buildings, a whole rating system of how you can build in a sustainable and more environmental way. So that hadn't been created. So that would have been interesting to have somebody from the Green Building there, but it didn't exist.
That's correct.
So you've got all these problems presented to you at your doorstep. And did anybody have any models they could point to at least and sort of send you out to take a look at or bring in after the charrette?
So in my discussions with Ray after that, it was like, okay, thanks. But, and so Ray suggested I visit George and Vicki Rainey, who were developing Prairie Crossing on the outskirts of Chicago.
Okay.
And while they were a little further from Chicago than we are Atlanta, it was exact match. They had 2,300 acres, and they were concerned about the development sprawl of Chicago. Okay. And they were just in the early stages, but it had began, and they did have a very simple web page that was available then. And as I looked at it, they were really dealing with the balance of preserved land and developed land. Mm-hmm. And that is where I got my 30-70% ratio that I knew that could work.
Okay.
They had a wonderful model on stormwater, and they were introducing agriculture. And so I thought, oh, thank you. This, I'll just go and they can come help me, or I'll hire all their consultants, and we've gotten, what we need. Right. This will do it.
Voila.
And so through the introductions, we called, and of course they were very gracious and invited us to stay with them in their home. Lovely. And we flew to O'Hara and rented the car. And as I'm driving out, I have expectations to see the countryside.
Between Chicago and Prairie Crossing.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. And I kept waiting for the open countryside. And while we saw some of it, I saw all this development going on of traditional subdivisions and some strip malls. And then we arrived at the Rainey's Land and Prairie Crossing, and it was beautiful, and you felt it while you were there. And then during our stay, and I loved what they were doing with all these things. Their stormwater remains, some of the cutting-edge stormwater. Mm-hmm. They had really clustered all of the housing development. They were doing a charter school because it was the prairies. They instituted burns every winter, and so they burned the prairie, and here they were in the residential. So fantastic things that I really loved. Being from an agriculture background, I saw that the farms were just off in a corner in its own fenced area, so they weren't part of the community. So that was one thing that seemed odd to me about that. And they really had no commercial, so it was basically a bedroom community done in this wonderful way. So we saw a lot of things we loved, but they shared with us then what a disappointment they had, because they felt they were going to do a model to show that there was a different way to do it. And they expected all the land around them to then be developed in a similar way. But what happened is they accelerated the development right next to them because people love to put housing next to their open fields.
Of course.
Rather than doing it themselves. And so that was my biggest eye-opener. And I came back, and at that point I realized I wasn't thinking large enough, that models rarely work, that you really have to have legislation, especially when you're in the front end of a concept, when people do not understand the advantages. And so I spent the next 2 years bringing 500 landowners together to create a common vision so that we could change the land use and the zoning for the greater area. So that if we did decide to do something special on our land as a model, we would not accelerate that destruction of the area, but we would actually be a model that could be used for the entire area.
Wow. So instead of becoming a magnet, which Prairie Crossing is, wonderful concept, it sounds like, but everything just sort of came right up to their land. Is that it?
That is correct.
And so they just became an island rather than a larger
that is correct.
Concept.
And you see that at Seaside. It happened the same thing. Robert Davis had a great concept in urbanism. And when it was created, it was this little village with these sand dunes on each side.
Beautiful.
And now it's just one development in a strip of developments, and you have to look carefully at the landscaping to see which development you're in.
Interesting. People have preconceived notions of how a development works and the traditional construct for a community development. Is that sort of part of the problem, that we don't know any better?
I believe some of the research is coming out as we look back, and someone said this is in the course of civilization and how we build cities, that the past 50, 60 years is going to be an incredible experience that didn't work.
Ouch.
And you can see where we got to this. After the war, there was a tremendous need for housing, and so you just scraped the fields and built houses as fast as you could. About the same time, we put in our interstate highway system that allowed people to travel large distances, and that was President Eisenhower, so that he could move troops across the country.
For war, yeah.
So it was a response to World War II that we developed in a different manner. And as the decades have gone on, it's become the model of what we think of as suburban community development. And it's to take these large swaths, see how many houses you can get in without very much idea of walkability, of stormwater, of connecting to nature, or even connecting to one another. Because at this same time, in the great American success, the yardstick for success seemed to be the bigger piece of property you could have. It's this idea of having your own estate. And so the larger pieces of property became further and further from the center city that people could buy. And then the idea of having your own swimming pool, having your own tennis court, having your own cappuccino machine, having your own movie theater,
right,
all became measurements of supposed success. And suddenly, if you were in an area where all of your neighbors had the same thing, you weren't going to walk to your neighbors for anything, so we stopped putting sidewalks in many of these places.
Oh, that's a great point.
Then everyone started becoming concerned about all the toys they had put together and somebody might steal them, so we put armored fences around the compounds. And if you look at it from afar now, we've created our own prisons of luxury. And today we question why antidepressants are increasing fourfold each decade for the last decades. We've removed ourselves from each other and through our fences, through nature, our connection to nature. And research is now coming out that those are two of the greatest ingredients for mental health, and mental health affects our physical health. So I think the development community was in a tradition of community development, and it actually turned into a rut.
Yeah.
And no one's thinking about doing it any way differently. And the financial community is largely to blame, because they always want feasibility studies. And the only way you can create a feasibility study is to look in the rearview mirror.
Right.
And so anytime there's new thought, such as we had, it's impossible to create a feasibility study.
Right.
And so this is community development or any new products. You really have to be willing to get out there up front and find the financial resources to carry you forward without the traditional systems.
Right. And then it makes me think that you were mentioning depression, but the, obesity epidemic, we've taken away the sidewalks and there's nowhere to go because you're going to get hit by a car, or there's nowhere to go in some of those developments. So I guess there's no need for a sidewalk because basically you're going to have to get in your car and drive somewhere to go anywhere.
The poor health epidemic that's in front of us today is two key things, I believe. We have removed ourselves from the source of our food. And so generally we are not consuming fresh food. And for the first time in civilization, we have obesity and malnutrition in the same body. Now, there's something seriously wrong with that when our food industry is pushing empty calories and calling it food.
Right.
And so removing ourselves from the food production, we have lost the thought of what food really is. And so if we're putting chemicalized food in our bodies for shelf life, we're not going to burn it. So even if we're walking a lot, if you're having a lot of preservatives in your food, it's going to preserve the fat layers around your stomach just as well as it does the food that went in. Where if you have the richest of creams, pure sugar, you're going to burn that if you walk.
Right.
But then you have to have a place to walk to or from.
And you have to have sidewalk or somewhere to walk on.
It's kind of the crazy society that we're in, where people get in their car and drive to the gym that's on the third floor, and they take the escalator to the third floor so they can work out for an hour. That's kind of the upside down world we're living in so many ways, that we are disconnected for the reasons and the purposes we do things or how we do it. It's just not an authentic life. It's a very manufactured life. So
now that you sort of are a developer, right? You've sort of backed into that role.
I'm a developer by default.
I'm a developer by default. Can you look back at this besides saying we can see historically that it wasn't great or it hasn't been the best, maybe some of the best models. Why weren't people developing this way? Do you have a little bit of perspective or?
Well, absolutely. As I think back to that role from hospitality to a retired gentleman, I guess you could say, who
country farmer.
I danced around the environmental issues, I guess, because it was just the right way to live. I didn't think of myself as an environmentalist, but it was just, fresh food, enjoying the landscape, walks in nature. It was just part of our lifestyle. And so I didn't think of myself as an environmentalist or any of those issues. And as I was pushed through that threshold to do something about it, Ray Anderson really kind of pushed me there. And I can't quite remember the day or the instance, but from not wanting to be a developer, but to simply want to find someone to help me save my backyard, suddenly I realized that I had to develop to show that there was another alternative. And I can't remember when that day of passion happened, but at some point, no matter how many roadblocks I ran into, it empowered me that I had to do it rather than it was too much. But I was in a unique position that, number one, I had been very involved in the civic and political structure of Metro Atlanta and Georgia.
Okay.
And so I knew who to call when I ran into roadblocks, and I realized not everyone knows how to do that.
Right.
The other thing is I was a big believer in Midtown Atlanta in the 70s when that was sort of just full of bars and drug dealers and no one was thinking about it. There were weeds literally on Peachtree Street.
Oh, wow.
And but I could afford that property. That's where I put my first restaurant and then my corporate headquarters. And I bought property there in the 70s. And so between being very successful with the restaurants in my sale and my Midtown properties, I had no debt. So as I had bought this land and was moving forward with development, I didn't have to answer to the clock ticking on an interest on a loan, and that's a position most developers are in.
I see.
So because I had access to decision makers and because I had my own resources, I was in that unique position where I could really look at the issues and fight the issues. And to my surprise, I had tremendous excitement that number one, the passion was there, and when I realized that we were going to develop. And then when we were able to bring 500 landowners together for the largest land use change in recent history in Metro Atlanta, I thought, man, we're going to do something so incredible. And now I can break ground on Serenbe and really show people how this can be done.
Right.
And how easy and not overly expensive. And this is just going to be such a great model. And while I did not want to fund it myself, I felt, and to tie all my resources up, I thought it was such a good idea that I knew there'd be investors lining up to do this. And so that's when we made these great boxes that you see that I call our early brochures.
Yes.
So these were wonderful boxes to show the uniqueness of what we were going to do to both develop and protect the land. Well, no one wanted to invest. And now, this many years later, several of the people that I had invited down tell me how hard they laughed on their way back to Atlanta about this idea that I was doing and how out of touch I was in my 7th year of retirement. And so then I realized that really the smart thing to do was leverage and borrow money, and most of the traditional banks turned me down.
Right.
Main Street was headquartered in Madison, Georgia, and they had brought a team here to look at land preservation and some of the things going on east of Atlanta. And the president and owner of the bank was part of that. And I said, by the way, I want to actually show Serenbe as an example, and we need to borrow money to make this happen. Well, they were gracious in setting it up, but I had to leverage my Midtown property about $4 to $1.
Okay.
So even though friendly forces, no one really believed this was going to be financially successful. And so because I did have the resources, I could move forward in the right way. And I realized that's unique and why most people aren't able to. Even developers that want to do the right thing had trouble doing that. Now, fast forward 20 years, that's all changed.
Right. I think many of the developers are just sitting on a ticking interest clock, and that's part of the problem, right? They're going to be as efficient and quick to get things out of the ground as they can. And so that's maybe part of the problems that we see is that everything has been sort of templatized or made, I guess, more efficient, right? We're clear cut all the trees. There's these specific ways that we do it because that's faster and quicker and cheaper. And sometimes that's not always the best answer.
That's right. If you look back at the last 5 decades of development, it's become very efficient. What we're just beginning to look at is the cost of that efficiency to our human life. Right. And while the development community has been efficient and cost-effective to produce shelter, we have also increased our costs for health. CDC has the reports that in 1950 we were spending 3% of our GDP on health. It was projected to hit 17% by 2020. But the statistics out in 2016, it was 17.7 already, and it's projected to be 50% by 2035.
That's incredible.
So while we've been efficient in creating shelter, we have not looked at the costs on our human health,
right,
and our lifestyle and depression and all those other things.
And that's interesting that you say that. So, right, efficient for producing shelter. So I'll call it a silo. That's one thing. It's not thinking about the system as a whole. And I know that you kind of mentioned sort of when you went to Prairie Crossing, you saw some good things that were happening. You've talked about policy silos in the past. And I think that, I don't know if you would call producing shelter a policy silo, but it is a niche or a vertical of its own. Tell me a little bit about how you, in the research and in learning what was going on a global scale, what were some of the policy things that you saw that developers weren't thinking about in a system, that they were just looking at it as one?
Because I was not a developer, I was able to look at the issues with new eyes. And because of the leadership through the Rocky Mountain Institute, we were able to look at cross disciplines as it affected the development community, because none of it was coming from the development community per se. And in doing this, I was enthused about all these answers. And at that point, I started understanding the siloed thinking in both regulation, development, utility industries. Everyone was in siloed situations. And I found out that of all the things we wanted to do, at least 50% was not allowed.
Not allowed? Not allowed,
or against the law. And so over the course of the next years, I had to get exceptions. Of course, we totally changed the zoning for this area, so that helped a lot. But there were, federal, state, and local regulations that prevented us from doing what I perceived was the right thing to do for the environment and for human health. And that just amazed me. I think... for instance, you'll see most development, they scrape the land. So it's a very basically flat landscape, no matter what it looked like prior to development. Well, there's several things forcing that. It's more than the efficiency that they see. The Environmental Protection Division will only allow streets for safety and other reasons to be a minimum grade. So it can't be very hilly. Now,
what if there's hills?
That means
what do you do?
We're cutting more hills down to me, it's taking away the charm, but irregardless of that, they're cutting the hills down. Now, that division is not looking at the division worried about our clean waters. Mm-hmm. Because when you cut the hill, you're creating problems for the stream below that hill.
Okay.
But those two departments aren't talking about a solution to where you don't have to cut the hills to do that.
But because my grade can only be a certain grade,
then you have to cut the hills if you're gonna get that
and if I cut the hill, then the water goes down.
And then you're required to spend a lot of money in stormwater issues, but yet you're not required to test the water.
No.
You know, I've often said all this money you go to create whatever the book says you should do, it has no relationship to how that might really affect your physical spot. So I think we would save a lot of money and have clearer streams if anyone developing had to test, or the local agencies could test the stream below the development site. And then the developer is charged with keeping it within a certain range of that cleanliness during development.
Right.
Well, then you could understand how to do that on your own property in the most efficient way.
Sure.
But today, as long as you do what they say, you've checked the boxes, and if you end up polluting the stream, it's not your fault.
It's not about the end result. It's about following the rules.
It's about follow the rules, irregardless of what the end result is. And that's just one example of where I saw this is happening over and over and over. And then even when I passed those hurdles in various ways, the power company was not going to run power unless I cleared at least 15 feet on each side of the road. So to do that, you'd have to cut the hill and take all the trees down. And
this is the road into the community?
In the community and next to all the roads in the community.
What?
So this is why you see these stripped areas, because these are two of the biggest barriers you run into in development that are very necessary. So your utilities and your rules with the Environmental Protection Division on how we should be responsibly developing. So they're all well-intended rules, maybe, but they're so not looking at the application in today on specific sites that they're causing more problems than they're solving.
Right.
And that's just two examples of many that I ran into.
I feel like I'm at the end of your charrette listening to all the problems. So tell me, I know that having gone through the charrette and talking to Ray, you kind of felt more knowledgeable, but then more responsible about what you could do. But you've already at this point sort of retreated to the country, if you will. And now Ray really has pushed you. I think that his famous quote, right, is he says to you, if not...
Well, Ray, yes. So two things about Ray that really pushed me. When I was really frustrated and realizing that there was no one giving me the answer, that as much as I like Prairie Crossing, that was they had consultants I could hire, but it was just a piece of the issue. Mm-hmm. And that was when Ray said, if not you, who? If not now, when? Mm-hmm. And, of course, Ray's other big thing is that what we're doing today is for tomorrow's unknown child. And how personal that is, because when I did this, I never imagined my daughters all coming back here, and those unknown children of 2000 are my grandchildren of today on the streets of Serenbe.
I know. I love that. Well, this has been great, and I really, really appreciate it. So we're going to say goodbye to our next episode, but next time we're going to talk about more of these roadblocks. So thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Serenbe Stories. New episodes are available on Mondays. You can subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts. For more details, visit our website, serenbestories.com.